Imagine you're running a giant factory in Germany. Not a cute little workshop, one of those industrial beasts that turns raw materials into the things the world actually uses: steel, chemicals, machinery, cars. You walk in early, the way you always do. You expect the usual soundtrack: compressors humming, conveyors rattling, forklifts beeping, the steady roar of production. But today it feels wrong. The machines are still there. The orders are still there. Your people are still ready to work. And yet the floor is quiet, because the simplest ingredient of modern industry, electricity, has become so expensive and so uncertain that turning the whole place on feels like lighting money on fire. That's the nightmare scenario, and in recent years Germany has brushed uncomfortably close to it. Now, before someone clips this and turns it into a tribal fight, this isn't a green bad rant, and it isn't a Germany is doomed speech. It's a case study, a story about good intentions colliding with physics, geopolitics, and the reality of running an industrial economy without breaking ordinary families. Before we continue, I want to clear one thing: that this video is AI, generated for educational purposes only. It is not financial advice. Do your own research and consult qualified professionals before making decisions. Alright, here's the story. Germany set out on one of the most ambitious energy transitions ever attempted by a major economy. The plan had a simple moral appeal: less fossil fuel, more renewables, lower emissions, cleaner air, a model for the world. In public discussions, you'll often hear a huge price tag cited: hundreds of billions of dollars over the long run, spent through subsidies, grid upgrades, incentives, and policy programs. Exact totals vary depending on what's counted, but the scale is undeniably massive in public reporting and academic debate. And the painful question is, what did that spending buy, and what did it accidentally break? Because when people talk about energy, they picture light bulbs and phone chargers. Germany's problem is heavier than that. Energy in Germany is also blast furnaces, chemical reactors, glassmaking, fertilizer, industrial heat, the invisible backbone of an export economy. If you squeeze that backbone too hard, the pain doesn't stay in the energy sector. It spreads into jobs, wages, supply chains, and eventually politics. To understand how the trap formed, you have to rewind to a moment when Germany was actually in a relatively strong position. Back around 2010, Germany's electricity mix had multiple pillars. It had coal, it had growing renewables, and it also had nuclear power, providing a significant chunk of steady, always on electricity. That last part matters more than people realize, because wind and solar are beautiful when they're producing, but they don't produce on command. They produce when the weather cooperates, and modern economies don't run on weather forecasts, they run on reliability. So the sensible version of the transition looks like this: keep your stable power sources running while you gradually scale up renewables, improve grids, add storage, and build backup capacity. You cross the river by building the bridge first. Then came 2011. Japan suffered the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster followed. It was tragic, it was terrifying to watch, and emotionally, it hit the world like a thunderclap. Germany is not Japan. It doesn't sit on the same seismic fault lines. It doesn't face the same tsunami risks. But politics is often less about engineering comparisons and more about public fear and public trust. In Germany, nuclear power had already been controversial for decades. Fukushima didn't create that debate, it supercharged it. So Germany made a decision that shaped everything that came after it: accelerated the phase out of nuclear power. Pause here and let's be fair. People who supported the phase out weren't cartoon villains. Many were genuinely worried about safety, waste storage, and catastrophic risk. In Islamic ethics, protecting life and preventing harm is a serious objective. Fear of harm isn't automatically irrational, but here's where decision-making can slip. You can choose to remove a risk in one category and accidentally increase risk in another category, like affordability, reliability, and geopolitical exposure. And that's what made this decision so expensive, because shutting down functioning nuclear plants doesn't just change an emissions chart. It changes the whole structure of your grid. It removes steady, low-carbon electricity that can run 24/7. And it forces you to replace that stability with something else. Here's an easy analogy. If your house has a reliable heater and you want to move to a new system, you don't smash the old heater during the coldest month and say, "Inshallah it'll work out." You install the new system, test it, confirm it can handle the nights when it's freezing, and then you retire the old one responsibly. Germany, under intense public pressure, moved faster than its infrastructure could comfortably support. So what fills the gap when you remove steady nuclear generation? If you're trying to reduce coal long-term, the common bridge fuel is natural gas. It's flexible. Power plants can ramp up quickly. It works well for industrial heat, and compared to coal, it's generally lower in emissions per unit of energy. But there's a catch that becomes obvious only when the world turns hostile. If you don't produce much gas domestically, you become dependent on whoever sells it to you. and Germany built a model that leaned heavily on imported natural gas, including large volumes from Russia. Public data over the years showed Russia becoming a major supplier for Germany's gas needs, and by the early 2020s, dependence was widely discussed as a strategic vulnerability. The exact percentage depends on the year and the metric, but the direction was clear. A lot of German industry was quietly running on the assumption that cheap pipeline gas would remain available, stable, and politically safe. That assumption held until it didn't. You can almost see the chain reaction. Remove nuclear capacity, add lots of wind and solar, use gas to stabilize the system when renewables dip, get comfortable with a huge single supplier because it's cheaper and convenient. Then a geopolitical shock hits and your bridge becomes a choke point. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Europe's energy picture changed fast. Prices surged, supply became uncertain. Governments scrambled. Germany had to pivot toward alternative supplies, including liquefied natural gas shipped by sea, which often costs more because it requires cooling, transport, and regasification infrastructure. Public reports described emergency measures, subsidies, and massive government involvement to prevent a broader economic spiral. Now, let's apply the fact-check-minded lens for a moment. You'll hear dramatic numbers thrown around, claims of prices rising tenfold or 1,000%, or industry bills exploding overnight. The precise peak depends on where you measure, but the underlying reality is not controversial. The shock was severe enough that major industrial players and policymakers treated it as an emergency. And that's the part many people miss. An energy transition isn't just a climate plan. It's also an industrial strategy. If energy becomes structurally more expensive than competitors, factories don't merely complain, they adapt. Sometimes adaptation means investing in efficiency, which is good. Sometimes it means passing costs to consumers, which hurts households. And sometimes it means leaving. This is where the phrase, deindustrialization, enters the conversation. It sounds academic, but it's simple. If you can't produce competitively, production migrates, capital moves, new plants get built elsewhere, and when heavy industry leaves, it's not like a coffee shop closing down and reopening later. These are decades-long investments. Once a complex chemical site or a major manufacturing line relocates, it tends to stay gone. Now let me add an Islamic adab point here, because it matters. In times of crisis, whether it's energy prices, supply shocks, or inflation, there's always temptation for people to exploit others' hoarding, price gouging, dishonest selling, or pushing misleading solutions. That's not just unethical, it's spiritually corrosive. A Muslim lens reminds us: be truthful, do not deceive, do not take advantage of desperation, and don't build your livelihood on harming others. A society survives turbulence not only through policy, but through character. So where does this leave Germany in the story? It leaves Germany caught between three forces: the moral desire to cut emissions quickly, the physical reality that wind and solar are intermittent, the geopolitical reality that dependence on imported fuel can become a vulnerability overnight. And that triangle creates the trap. You can't just wish your way out. You have to engineer your way out. Now let's make this personal, because policy debates can feel abstract until you put a face on it. Imagine you're a retired couple in a paid-off home. You did everything right. You saved. You didn't live beyond your means. You're not trying to become rich, you're trying to stay warm without anxiety. Then energy prices rise, and suddenly you're hearing talk about mandatory upgrades, new heating systems, new standards, new deadlines. Even if the technology is good, the cost and the communication can feel like a threat. And when ordinary people feel cornered, politics gets ugly fast. Hold that thought, because in the next part of this story, we're going to zoom in on what happened to German industry on the ground, why some major companies started scaling down investment at home while building new capacity abroad, and how energy policy collided with the reality of global competition. Quick question for you: if you were designing a national energy plan, what would you prioritize first, the lowest emissions, the lowest cost, or the highest reliability? Drop your answer in the comments, because your choice reveals how you see the world. And if you want more breakdowns like this, calm, analytical, and free of hysteria, tap like and subscribe. It tells the algorithm this kind of serious storytelling is worth recommending. When people talk about energy transitions, they often picture shiny wind turbines on a hill, solar panels glinting in the sun, and politicians cutting ribbons in front of big banners that say future and progress. But the real story doesn't unfold at press conferences. It unfolds in boardrooms where executives quietly run spreadsheets. It unfolds in town halls where workers ask uncomfortable questions. It unfolds in industrial parks where the lights start turning off one building at a time. If you want to understand what Germany's energy gamble actually changed, you don't start with ideology. You start with factories, because Germany is not Silicon Valley. Its wealth was not built on social media apps or cloud software. It was built on things you can touch: engines, turbines, chemicals, precision tools, industrial machines. An export economy that turns energy into physical value. That model only works if energy is reliable and reasonably priced. Take a place like Ludwigshafen, home to one of the world's largest chemical complexes. For decades, this single site consumed extraordinary amounts of energy, comparable to what small countries use. It turned raw materials into fertilizers, plastics, pharmaceuticals, coatings, inputs that feed entire global supply chains. For most of modern history, Germany's advantage was simple, stable infrastructure, skilled labor, and energy that was cheap enough to make those massive plants competitive. But when energy costs swing wildly, long-term planning becomes almost impossible. Public company statements over the last few years tell a consistent story. European operations are being optimized, capacity is being adjusted, investment is being redirected. Those are polite words. Translated into plain English, some production is leaving Europe, not all at once. Not in a dramatic mass shutdown, but gradually, relentlessly, decision by decision. If you're a multinational company deciding where to build your next major facility, you look at three things first. Can I get power? Can I afford it? Can I trust it will still be available and affordable 10 or 20 years from now? If the answer to any of those is shaky, you start shopping elsewhere, and elsewhere increasingly means places with cheaper energy and aggressive industrial incentives. China, the United States, parts of the Middle East, and other regions actively courting manufacturing. This doesn't mean Germany is becoming a wasteland. That kind of exaggeration helps no one, but it does mean Germany is losing its old position as the default location for energy-intensive heavy industry. That shift has consequences that ripple outward. When a chemical plant scales down, it doesn't just affect chemists. It affects truck drivers, maintenance crews, equipment suppliers, local restaurants. Entire towns built around a single industrial anchor. These are the kinds of middle-class jobs that create stability. Not glamorous, but foundational. Once they're gone, replacing them with green jobs isn't automatic. Wind technicians and solar installers matter, but they don't always match the wages, union protections, or long-term career paths of traditional heavy industry. So you end up with a painful mismatch, a society that still needs industrial-level prosperity, but is slowly shedding the very activities that historically generated it. Now zoom out to the grid itself, because this is where the engineering side of the story becomes almost surreal. Germany's geography creates a simple problem. Most of the best wind resources are in the north, near the North Sea and Baltic Sea. Many of the largest industrial consumers are in the south, in regions famous for automotive and high-tech manufacturing. Electricity has to travel between those two zones. That requires massive high-voltage transmission lines. Building those lines sounds straightforward in theory. In practice, it collides with environmental reviews, property rights, lawsuits, and local opposition. People like clean energy in the abstract. They often dislike giant pylons near their backyard. So projects that were supposed to be finished years ago are still under construction, redesigned, or delayed. And here's where the system starts behaving in ways that feel almost absurd. On very windy days in northern Germany, turbines can produce more electricity than the local grid can safely handle. You might think, great, extra clean power! But electricity grids must stay in balance. Too much power in one place with nowhere to send it can destabilize the system. So grid operators sometimes have to order wind farms to reduce output or shut down temporarily. Now comes the strange part. Under existing rules and contracts, many operators still receive compensation for that curtailed power. So consumers are effectively paying for electricity that was technically generated, but never used. At the same time, factories in the south, which can't access that surplus wind power because transmission lines aren't finished, may be running gas or coal plants to meet demand. So in some situations, society pays. Once for renewable power that didn't reach customers, and again for fossil fuel power that did. This isn't a conspiracy. It's a structural design problem, but design problems cost real money. Public data shows congestion management and grid stabilization costs in Germany rising into the billions of euros annually. Exact figures change year to year, but the trend is clear. Operating a fragmented, stressed grid is expensive. Who ultimately covers that cost? Households, small businesses, anyone who opens an electricity bill. And when people see their bills doubling or tripling over a few years, they don't respond with academic patience. They respond emotionally. Which brings us back to homes and heating. For many years, Germany encouraged efficiency upgrades and cleaner heating systems. That's sensible. Buildings account for a large share of energy use in most countries. But in the early 2020s, the government proposed rules that would sharply limit or eventually ban new installations of traditional oil and gas boilers, steering homeowners toward electric heat pumps. On paper, heat pumps are impressive technology. They move heat rather than create it through combustion, which can make them very efficient. But technology never exists in a vacuum. Heat pumps work best in well-insulated homes with modern heating systems. Many German houses are old, solid, and poorly insulated by today's standards. Installing a heat pump in such a home often isn't just a swap. It can require upgrading insulation, replacing radiators, sometimes modifying floors or piping. Public estimates for total costs vary widely depending on the house and region, but ranges in the tens of thousands of dollars or euros are commonly discussed. For a young professional couple with good income, that's painful but maybe manageable. For an elderly person on a fixed pension, it feels catastrophic. Even when subsidies exist, upfront costs, paperwork, and uncertainty create fear, and fear spreads faster than policy explanations. The political backlash was swift, not because people hate efficiency, not because they love pollution, but because they felt trapped by a timeline that didn't match their financial reality. Here's an uncomfortable truth about transitions. Speed matters. Move too slowly, and you don't solve the problem. Move too fast, and you break social trust. Once trust breaks, even good ideas become toxic. Ironically, the confusion around heating rules led many households to rush out and install new gas boilers before restrictions tightened, locking in fossil fuel equipment for another decade or two. A policy meant to reduce gas use ended up, in the short term, encouraging more gas installations. That's not evil intent, that's poor sequencing. Now let's zoom out again to emissions, because this is where headlines can mislead. You'll often hear that Germany's carbon emissions have fallen to multi-decade lows. Public data does show a significant drop in recent years, but the crucial question is, why did they fall? Part of the reduction comes from renewables. That's real, but another major contributor is reduced industrial output. When factories slow down or shut down, energy consumption falls. When energy consumption falls, emissions fall. That's a mathematical fact. But it's not the same as achieving a thriving low-carbon industrial economy. It's the difference between we produce the same amount of value with cleaner energy versus we produce less value. From a climate accounting perspective, both show lower emissions. From a societal perspective, they are worlds apart. This is why some analysts warn about confusing decarbonization with deindustrialization. One is progress, the other is shrinkage. There's also a regional comparison that makes Germany's choices more controversial. Neighboring France generates a large share of its electricity from nuclear power. Nuclear plants produce extremely low direct carbon emissions during operation. As a result, France's electricity grid is among the lowest carbon in Europe. Germany, having shut down its nuclear fleet, relies more heavily on coal and gas during periods when wind and solar output is low. So paradoxically, Germany's grid can be significantly more carbon intensive than France's, even though Germany is often portrayed as the renewable champion. That doesn't mean renewables are bad. It means eliminating one major low-carbon source before fully replacing its function creates problems. Now let's step back and breathe. It's easy to turn this story into a morality play with villains and heroes. Reality is messier. Germany's leaders were responding to public fear after nuclear accidents. They were responding to legitimate climate concerns. They were trying to balance competing pressures. Mistakes don't always come from malice. Often they come from underestimating complexity. From an Islamic ethical perspective, this matters. We're taught that intentions matter, but outcomes matter too. Good intentions do not automatically make an action wise, and wisdom requires humility, acknowledging uncertainty, seeking knowledge, and being willing to adjust course when evidence changes. So what lessons emerge so far? 1. Energy systems are physical systems. You cannot negotiate with physics. 2. Redundancy is not waste, it is resilience. 3. Transitions work best when they are layered. New capacity built first, old capacity retired later. 4. Social acceptance depends on fairness. If ordinary people feel crushed while elites remain comfortable, policies will not survive. Before we move into the final part of this story, I want to ask you something simple. If your government announced tomorrow that you must replace a major appliance in your home within 2 years, and the cheapest option cost as much as a small car, how would you feel? Drop your honest reaction in the comments. And if this kind of deep, balanced analysis is useful to you, consider liking and subscribing. It helps this channel reach people who want understanding instead of shouting matches. So where does all of this leave Germany today? Not in ruins, not in triumph either. Somewhere in between, standing at a crossroads, carrying the weight of decisions made over more than a decade, trying to adapt in real time while the world watches. Public economic data over the past few years shows a pattern that worries policymakers: weak growth, periodic contraction, and business confidence that remains fragile. Other major economies stumble too, but Germany's slowdown feels different because it strikes at the heart of its traditional model. For generations, the formula was simple: import large amounts of energy and raw materials, use world-class engineering and skilled labor, export high-value industrial goods to the world. That engine depended on two hidden assumptions. Energy would stay affordable, supply would be reliable. Both assumptions have been shaken. And once that happens, everything becomes harder. Investment decisions become cautious, hiring slows, long-term projects get postponed. Not because companies suddenly hate Germany, but because uncertainty is poison to capital. Now here's the uncomfortable part. There is no magic switch that fixes this. You cannot rebuild a nuclear fleet overnight. You cannot upgrade an entire national grid in a year. You cannot retrain millions of workers instantly. Transitions of this scale take decades. That doesn't mean Germany is finished. It means Germany is in a painful middle phase. Some policymakers talk about revisiting nuclear power in limited forms, or exploring next-generation reactors in the long term. Others focus heavily on hydrogen, large-scale batteries, and cross-border electricity trading within Europe. All of these technologies have potential. None of them are silver bullets today. Hydrogen, for example, can store energy and provide industrial heat, but producing green hydrogen requires enormous amounts of cheap electricity, which brings us right back to the original challenge. Large batteries can smooth short-term fluctuations, but they are not yet capable of backing up an entire industrial economy for days or weeks. Interconnected European grids help, but they also spread risk. When everyone is short on power during a cold, windless winter week, neighbors can't magically supply what doesn't exist. So the realistic path forward is not a dramatic revolution, it's incremental repair. More grid investment, more storage, more realistic timelines, more technological diversity, and perhaps the hardest shift of all, more honesty. Honesty about trade-offs, honesty about costs, honesty about what current technology can and cannot do. Because one of the most damaging aspects of Germany's experience wasn't simply that mistakes were made. Mistakes are inevitable in complex systems. The deeper problem was overselling certainty, telling people that everything would be cheap, easy, and painless. When reality contradicted that promise, trust collapsed. Now zoom out beyond Germany. Why does this story matter to everyone else? Because many countries are attempting their own versions of energy transitions. Different designs, different speeds, different political cultures. But the underlying physics is the same everywhere. The lesson is not, don't build renewables. The lesson is not, stick with fossil fuels forever. The lesson is sequencing and balance. Build new capacity before destroying old capacity. Maintain multiple sources of reliable baseload power. Design policy around engineering reality, not slogans. And never forget the human layer. If a policy cannot be survived by ordinary families, it will not survive politically. Now let's talk about a moral dimension that rarely appears in energy debates. Islamic ethics emphasize stewardship of the earth. We are caretakers, not owners. Wastefulness is discouraged. Pollution that harms others is wrong. So concern for the environment is not foreign to Islam. It is embedded in it. At the same time, Islam also emphasizes justice, balance, and the protection of people from hardship. Policies that unintentionally push the poor into deeper struggle violate that balance. So a truly ethical energy transition must satisfy two obligations at once: is reduce harm to the environment, reduce harm to people, not one at the expense of the other. This dual responsibility is often missing from political discourse, which tends to swing between extremes. One side says, save the planet no matter the cost. The other says, ignore the planet, protect growth at all costs. Both positions are incomplete. Reality lives in the tension between them. Now let's return to the big number often mentioned in discussions of Germany's transition. Hundreds of billions spent over time. Was that money wasted? Not entirely. Germany now has a large renewable fleet. It has advanced grid technology in many areas. It has built experience that other countries can learn from. But did Germany get the maximum benefit possible from that spending? Public debate inside Germany suggests many experts believe the answer is no. Not because renewables are useless, but because shutting down functioning nuclear plants early forced much of that investment to replace existing capacity, instead of adding new clean capacity. In simpler terms, a lot of money went into running in place. That's an expensive way to stand still. So what would a more grounded strategy look like, in broad terms? Keep every low-carbon source that is safe and functional online while alternatives mature. Expand renewables aggressively, but in parallel with storage and grid upgrades. Diversify energy imports rather than concentrating dependence on a single supplier. Communicate honestly about costs and timelines. Protect vulnerable households from sudden shocks. None of this is revolutionary. It's just disciplined, boring, technocratic, which is often exactly what works. Let me pause here and ask you something. If you were advising your own country, what would you prioritize more right now? Speed of change or stability of change? Type your answer in the comments. Now there's another subtle lesson hiding in Germany's story. Being a role model is dangerous. Germany wanted to show moral leadership. That's admirable. But when leadership turns into moral performance, doing things primarily to signal virtue rather than optimize outcomes, you risk making symbolic choices instead of practical ones. Other nations, especially developing ones, are watching closely. Many of them look at Germany and think, we cannot afford that experiment. They still prioritize cheap and reliable energy because they are trying to lift millions out of poverty. Whether we like it or not, that's their reality. So if wealthy countries want the world to follow cleaner paths, they must demonstrate models that are both clean and prosperous, not clean and shrinking. Now let's come back to a calmer place. Germany still has extraordinary strengths: deep engineering culture, highly educated workforce, strong institutions, financial capacity. Those don't vanish because of bad policy choices, but rebuilding momentum will require humility, admitting that some decisions didn't work as planned, adjusting course without turning it into a culture war. That's hard. Politicians fear admitting mistakes. But societies that cannot admit mistakes tend to repeat them. From an Islamic perspective, this idea is familiar. Tawbah, turning back, correcting course, is not weakness, it is strength. Recognizing error and seeking a better path is a sign of maturity. So what should ordinary viewers take away from this story? First, be skeptical of anyone who claims complex problems have simple, painless solutions. Second, understand that energy policy affects everything: jobs, food prices, housing costs, national security. Third, demand honesty from leaders, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Fourth, in your own life, aim for resilience. Diversify your skills, avoid excessive debt, use energy efficiently where possible. Support solutions that are ethical, realistic, and gradual. And finally, remember character. In times of transition, some people panic, some hoard, some exploit. Choose to be among those who act with integrity. Pay fair prices. Treat others with dignity. Don't spread misinformation. Don't celebrate the suffering of any nation or people, because hardship anywhere is a reminder of how fragile modern life really is. Germany's story is not a prophecy, it is a warning that good intentions are not enough, a warning that physics always gets the final vote, a warning that ideology cannot replace engineering. If other countries learn from this experience, then at least some good will come from Germany's painful lesson. If you found this series valuable, share it with someone who cares about the future but is tired of slogans. And if you want more long-form, thoughtful breakdowns like this, make sure you're subscribed. Thanks for watching.